I was standing in the marble foyer of my cousin's mansion in Millbrook Heights when my Aunt Delilah picked up my grandmother's necklace, laughed, and announced to the entire family gathering that I was wearing costume jewelry to a black tie event. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that 3 days later, Rothwell Associates Auction House would call me with news that would make every person in that room who had mocked me desperately wish they could take back their words. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Cassandra Whitmore, and until that humiliating evening at my cousin Beatrice's engagement party, I thought I was the disappointment of the Whitmore family. At 28, I was a struggling art teacher in downtown Riverdale, living paycheck to paycheck in a studio apartment while my cousins drove luxury cars and vacationed in the Hamptons. I was the granddaughter who had, quote, failed to live up to the family potential, according to my relatives, the one who chose passion over profit and art over advancement. The necklace that would change everything had been my grandmother Rosalind's most treasured possession. She'd worn it every day until her death when I was 15, and in her will, she left it specifically to me with a note that simply said, "For Cassie, who sees beauty where others see ordinary things." The piece itself seemed unremarkable. A delicate silver chain holding what appeared to be a simple blue stone pendant, no bigger than a quarter, with intricate but seemingly common metalwork around the edges. For 13 years, I'd worn it constantly, finding comfort in the connection to my grandmother, who had been the only family member who truly understood my artistic soul. While my parents pushed me toward business school and my cousins pursued careers in finance and law, Grandmother Rosalind had encouraged my painting, spent hours in museums with me, and taught me to appreciate beauty in unexpected places. The necklace had become my talisman, my reminder that at least one person in my family had believed in me. That October evening at Beatrice's engagement party was supposed to be a celebration, but it quickly became another reminder of my place in the family hierarchy. The event was being held at Beatrice's family estate, a sprawling Tudor mansion that screamed old money and established success. As I walked through the front doors in my carefully chosen vintage dress and grandmother's necklace, I felt the familiar knot of inadequacy forming in my stomach. The guest list read like a who's who of Millbrook Heights society. Beatrice, my cousin on my mother's side, was marrying Jonathan Ashford III, heir to a pharmaceutical fortune, and everyone who mattered in our social circle was there to witness the union of two wealthy families. I had been invited, I suspected, more out of obligation than genuine affection, a token gesture to include the artsy cousin who taught high school students and lived in what my Aunt Delilah called that bohemian neighborhood. The first few hours of the party passed without incident. I made small talk with distant relatives, complimented Beatrice on her engagement ring, and tried to blend into the background while nursing a single glass of champagne that I was making last all evening. But as the night progressed and the alcohol flowed more freely, the family's true opinions about my life choices began to surface. It started with my cousin Frederick, Beatrice's older brother, who worked at an investment firm and never missed an opportunity to remind me of his success. "Still teaching, Cassie?" he asked with a condescending smile. "I heard there's an opening in our HR department if you ever want to try a real career." His wife, Priscilla, giggled at what she clearly thought was clever wit, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the light as she gestured dismissively. Then came my Aunt Delilah, my mother's sister, who had always viewed my life choices as a personal affront to the family's reputation. She approached me near the dessert table, her perfectly coiffed silver hair and designer gown making me feel even more out of place in my carefully thrifted outfit. "Cassandra, dear," she said in the tone that had made me cringe since childhood, "I do hope you're not planning to wear that accessory to the wedding next month. She gestured toward my grandmother's necklace with barely concealed distaste. "I know you're sentimental about your grandmother's costume jewelry, but Beatrice's wedding is going to be quite formal. Perhaps something more appropriate." The conversation drew the attention of several nearby relatives, including my cousin Miranda, who worked as a jewelry buyer for an upscale department store and considered herself an expert on valuable accessories. She leaned in to examine my necklace more closely, her expression growing more amused by the second. "Oh my goodness, is that supposed to be a sapphire? Aunt Delilah, look at this!" She called over more family members, turning my grandmother's precious necklace into a spectacle for their entertainment. "The setting is so obviously machine-made, and that stone," she laughed, a sound that cut me through like a blade. Poor grandmother Rosalind must have been fooled by some traveling salesman decades ago. My face burned with humiliation as more relatives gathered around to examine and critique the necklace that meant everything to me. Uncle Harold, who owned a small chain of jewelry stores, joined the impromptu appraisal with the authority of someone who considered himself an expert. "The metalwork is decent craftsmanship for what it is," he pronounced, adjusting his reading glasses to peer at the pendant. "But definitely not precious metal. Probably silver-plated copper or some such thing. And that stone..." He shook his head with professional disappointment. "Blue glass, maybe a low-grade synthetic. The whole piece might be worth $50 retail, if that." The crowd around me erupted in knowing laughter, the kind that wealthy families reserve for discussing the financial mistakes of their less fortunate relatives. I felt tears pricking at my eyes as my cousin Beatrice, the bride-to-be herself, joined the circle with her fiancé Jonathan. "Cassie's always been so sentimental," Beatrice said, with the kind of fond condescension usually reserved for small children. "She probably thinks it's priceless because grandmother left it to her. It's actually quite sweet, in a way." Jonathan, who had been silent during the family's critique, finally spoke up. "You know, my family has some connections in the jewelry business. If Cassandra ever wants to have it properly appraised, I could arrange something. Sometimes pieces that look," he paused diplomatically, "modest can surprise you, though in this case..." He shrugged, leaving the sentence hanging with devastating implication. My Aunt Delilah seized the opportunity to deliver what she clearly thought was the final word on the subject. "That's very kind of you, Jonathan, but I think we all know what a real appraisal would show. Poor Rosalind was always more interested in the story behind a piece than its actual value. She probably bought this at some little shop thinking it was an antique when it was really just, well, what it obviously is." The laughter that followed felt like a physical blow. These people, my own family, were not just mocking a piece of jewelry, they were dismissing my grandmother's memory, my judgment, and, by extension, everything I valued in life. The necklace represented everything they couldn't understand about me. The belief that beauty and meaning weren't always measured in dollar signs, that sentiment and history could make something precious regardless of its market value. But as I stood there, surrounded by their amused faces and superior smiles, I made a decision that would prove to be the most important moment of my life. Instead of removing the necklace in shame or defending it futilely against their collective expertise, I lifted my chin and spoke with quiet dignity. "I appreciate your concern about my jewelry choices," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "But this necklace means more to me than any of you could possibly understand. Grandmother Rosalind left it to me specifically, and I'll continue wearing it with pride, regardless of what anyone thinks about its monetary value." The room fell silent for a moment, perhaps surprised by my unusual display of backbone against their unanimous judgment. Then Aunt Delilah laughed, a sound that would haunt me for the next 3 days. "Oh, Cassandra," she said, patting my arm with false sympathy, "you really are just like your grandmother. So much sentiment, so little sense about the real world." What none of them knew
What I was about to discover, in the most shocking way possible, was that my quiet, artistic grandmother had been keeping secrets that would turn their world of assumptions upside down. The woman they remembered as sentimental and impractical had actually been far more sophisticated about valuable things than any of them had ever imagined. As I left the party that night, driving home to my small apartment with their laughter still ringing in my ears, I had no idea that in exactly 72 hours, my phone would ring with news that would make every person in that marble foyer desperately wish they could take back their words. The necklace they had mocked as worthless costume jewelry was about to reveal secrets that would not only vindicate my grandmother's memory, but also transform my understanding of who I really was and where I truly belonged in this world. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. To understand how devastating that night at Beatrice's engagement party truly was, you need to know about the life I'd built in the shadow of the Whitmore family expectations. My world was small but meaningful, filled with the kind of beauty that couldn't be measured in bank statements or real estate portfolios. My apartment in downtown Riverdale sat above Mrs. Chen's bakery on Maple Street, a cramped studio that smelled perpetually of fresh bread and vanilla. The rent was affordable because the building was old, the walls were thin, and the heating was unpredictable, but it was mine. Every inch of the 400 square feet reflected my personality in ways that my childhood bedroom in my parents' Millbrook Heights estate never had. The walls were covered in artwork, some my own paintings, others pieces created by my students at Riverside High School. I taught art to teenagers who reminded me daily why I'd chosen this path, despite my parents' disapproval. There was Jamal, whose graffiti-inspired paintings captured the energy of urban life in ways that made my heart race. There was Amy, a quiet girl whose watercolor portraits revealed emotional depths that left me speechless. And there was David, whose sculptures, made from recycled materials, challenged everything I thought I knew about environmental art.
These kids didn't care that I drove a 12-year-old Honda Civic or that my clothes came from thrift stores. They cared that I saw their potential, encouraged their creativity, and fought for their art program when the school board threatened budget cuts. In their eyes, I wasn't the family disappointment. I was Miss Whitmore, the teacher who believed in them when no one else did. My daily routine was simple, but fulfilling. I woke up each morning to the sound of Mrs. Chen preparing the day's first batch of croissants, showered in my tiny bathroom, and dressed carefully in the vintage pieces I'd collected over the years. The necklace was always the final touch. Grandmother Rosalind's pendant settling into its familiar place against my collarbone like a daily blessing. The contrast between my life and my family's lifestyle had grown more pronounced over the years. While my cousins attended charity galas and country club events, I spent my weekends at local art fairs and community theater productions. While they discussed stock portfolios and real estate investments, I talked about color theory and artistic expression with fellow teachers at coffee shops that served fair trade beans in mismatched cups. My parents, Robert and Catherine Whitmore, had long since given up trying to redirect my career path, though they still held out hope that I might come to my senses and pursue something more financially stable. They lived in a sprawling colonial in the prestigious Whitmore Heights neighborhood, an area named after my great-great-grandfather who had made the family fortune in shipping during the early 1900s. Every Sunday, I dutifully attended family dinners at their home, enduring conversations about my cousin's latest achievements while picking at meals prepared by their housekeeper, Lucia. These gatherings followed a predictable pattern. Frederick would discuss his latest investment victories, Miranda would show off expensive jewelry from her travels, and Beatrice would detail her social calendar packed with exclusive events. My contributions to these conversations were politely received, but clearly viewed as quaint. When I talked about my students' breakthrough moments or shared excitement about a new art technique I was exploring, my family listened with the kind of patronizing attention usually reserved for children's imaginative stories. The Sunday dinner after my cousin's engagement party was particularly difficult. As I sat at the mahogany dining table that could seat 12, surrounded by family portraits and crystal chandeliers, I felt the weight of their judgment more heavily than usual. Aunt Delilah was there, of course, still basking in the social success of her daughter's engagement to pharmaceutical royalty. Cassandra wore the most interesting necklace to the party, she announced as Lucia served the second course. That little blue thing from Mother Rosalind. We all had quite a discussion about it. The laughter that followed felt like an echo of the humiliation from 3 nights earlier. My mother, Catherine, shot me a sympathetic but exasperated look that clearly communicated her wish that I would just conform for once in my life. "Mom," she said gently, "perhaps it's time to consider updating your jewelry collection. I'd be happy to take you shopping for something more contemporary." My father, Robert, who typically stayed out of what he called women's fashion discussions, nevertheless felt compelled to add his perspective. "Your grandmother was a lovely woman, Cassie, but she wasn't exactly sophisticated about valuable things. She was more interested in stories and sentiment than actual worth." This characterization of Grandmother Rosalind bothered me more than their criticism of my lifestyle choices. They remembered her as a sweet but naive woman who collected pretty things without understanding their value. But my memories of her were different, richer, more complex. Grandmother Rosalind had been the one who taught me to see beyond surface appearances. During our weekly museum visits when I was young, she would point out details in paintings that others missed, explain the historical context behind artifacts, and encourage me to ask questions that led to deeper understanding. She had possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of art history and could identify the provenance of pieces with remarkable accuracy. Her house had been filled with what the family considered her collections: antique books, vintage photographs, unusual pottery, and yes, jewelry that seemed modest but somehow emanated a quiet elegance. After her death, most of these items had been distributed among family members or donated to charity, dismissed as the accumulations of an elderly woman with more sentiment than sense. But I remembered the way she would handle each piece with reverence, the stories she would tell about their origins, and the careful way she would research anything new that came into her possession. Grandmother Rosalind hadn't been careless about valuable things. She had simply valued different qualities than the rest of the family. The necklace had been special to her in ways that went beyond mere sentiment. She had worn it constantly, but she had also protected it carefully, storing it in a small velvet box when she wasn't wearing it, and cleaning it with a soft cloth according to a specific routine she had taught me before her death. "Your necklace is more than it appears, Cassie," she had told me during one of our last conversations before she passed away. "Sometimes the most precious things are hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone who knows how to look properly." At the time, I had assumed she was speaking metaphorically about finding beauty in unexpected places, one of her favorite themes. But as I sat at my parents' dinner table, enduring yet another round of family criticism about my choices, I found myself wondering if there had been something more literal in her words. That evening, I returned to my small apartment feeling more isolated from my family than ever. I sat at my easel, trying to lose myself in a painting of the Riverdale waterfront at sunset, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important about the necklace and my grandmother's intentions. The pendant caught the light from my desk lamp as I worked, casting small blue reflections on the canvas. I paused in my painting to examine it more closely, running my fingers over the intricate metalwork that my family had dismissed as obviously machine-made. But looking at it with an artist's eye, I noticed subtleties in the craftsmanship that suggested hand-forging rather than mass production. The stone itself seemed to have depths that I hadn't noticed before, layers of blue that shifted depending on the angle of the light, and the setting, which my family had criticized as crude, actually showed remarkable attention to detail in its tiny decorative elements. For the first time since inheriting the necklace, I began to wonder if my family's quick dismissal had been premature. Not because I believed it was monetarily valuable, I had no reason to think that, but because I was starting to suspect that grandmother Rosalind had chosen it for reasons that went beyond simple sentimentality. As I prepared for bed that Sunday evening, carefully placing the necklace in the small jewelry box on my nightstand, I made a mental note to research antique jewelry evaluation, not to prove anything to my family, but to honor my grandmother's memory by understanding what she had found so special about this particular piece. I had no idea that my casual curiosity about the necklace's origins would lead to discoveries that would fundamentally change everything I thought I knew about my grandmother, my family, and myself. The life I had built as a struggling art teacher in downtown Riverdale was about to be transformed in ways I could never have imagined. Tuesday morning arrived like any other day, with the familiar sounds of Mrs. Chen's bakery preparations drifting up through my floorboards and the autumn sunlight streaming through my east-facing window. I dressed for another day of teaching, fastened the necklace around my neck as I had every day for 13 years, and prepared to face whatever challenges my students might present. I had no way of knowing that this ordinary Tuesday would be the last normal day of my old life. Wednesday morning brought an unexpected visitor to Riverside High School. I was in the middle of demonstrating watercolor blending techniques to my third period class when Principal Martinez knocked on my classroom door with an expression that immediately put me on alert. "Miss Whitmore, could I speak with you for a moment?" His tone carried the careful neutrality that educators use when something unusual but not necessarily problematic requires attention. "There's a gentleman here who says he needs to speak with you about a family matter." My first thought was that something had happened to my parents. At their age, unexpected visits from strangers often meant medical emergencies or legal issues. I quickly assigned my students a practice exercise and followed Principal Martinez to the main office, my mind racing through possibilities. The man waiting in the principal's conference room was not what I had expected. Tall and distinguished, probably in his early 50s, he wore an impeccably tailored charcoal suit and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to handling valuable things. His silver hair was perfectly styled, and his handshake was firm but respectful when Principal Martinez introduced us. "Miss Whitmore, my name is Dr. Edmund Thornfield. I'm a senior appraiser and authentication specialist with Rothwell Associates Auction House in Manhattan. I apologize for arriving unannounced, but I have some rather urgent questions about a piece of jewelry that may have belonged to your late grandmother, Rosalind Whitmore." The mention of my grandmother and her jewelry sent a chill down my spine, though I couldn't immediately understand why. Dr. Thornfield's presence seemed both official and slightly ominous, like the arrival of someone who brings news that changes everything, whether you want it to or not. "I'm not sure I understand," I said, settling into the chair across from him. "What kind of questions? And how did you know to find me here?" Dr. Thornfield opened a leather portfolio and withdrew several photographs, placing them carefully on the conference table between us. The images showed jewelry pieces that were clearly antique and obviously valuable. Ornate necklaces, elaborate brooches, and rings that sparkled even in the artificial light of the photographs. These pieces were recently discovered in a safety deposit box that had been abandoned for nearly 30 years. The box was registered under the name Rosalind Whitmore, with an address in Millbrook Heights. When the bank finally opened it, according to legal procedures, they found not only these jewelry pieces, but also documentation that suggests your grandmother may have been involved in some rather significant transactions in the international antique market. I stared at the photographs, trying to process what Dr. Thornfield was telling me. The woman in these images, if it was indeed my grandmother, was someone I had never known existed. These weren't the modest, sentimental pieces I remembered from her collection. These were museum-quality artifacts that spoke of serious money and sophisticated knowledge. "I think there might be some mistake," I said slowly.
My grandmother was a lovely woman, but she wasn't involved in any kind of international anything. She was interested in art and history, but as a hobby, not as a business.
Dr. Thornfield nodded, as if he had expected this response. That's actually quite common in cases like this. Many of the most successful dealers and collectors in the antique world prefer to maintain very low profiles, especially when dealing with pieces that have complicated provenance histories. The way he said complicated provenance made something cold settle in my stomach. I was beginning to understand that this conversation was heading somewhere I wasn't prepared to go. What exactly are you suggesting about my grandmother? I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. I'm not suggesting anything untoward, Dr. Thornfield clarified quickly, but the documentation we found indicates that Mrs. Whitmore was far more knowledgeable about valuable antiques than her family may have realized. She appears to have been involved in acquiring and, in some cases, selling pieces that would have required considerable expertise to authenticate and evaluate. He withdrew another set of documents from his portfolio. These ones clearly photocopies of handwritten letters and official-looking certificates. Even upside down, I could see my grandmother's distinctive handwriting on several of the pages. The reason I'm here, Miss Whitmore, is that among the documentation we found was a very specific inventory list. This list details several pieces that were apparently not stored in the safety deposit box, but were instead kept in Mrs. Whitmore's personal possession for what she called daily appreciation. One of these pieces is described as a cashmere sapphire pendant in hand-forged platinum setting, circa 1920, Cartier attribution pending verification. The words hit me like a physical blow. Cashmere sapphire, Cartier. These weren't terms associated with costume jewelry or sentimental baubles. These were words that meant serious, life-changing money. The description matches a necklace that Mrs. Whitmore specifically bequeathed to her granddaughter Cassandra in her will, Dr. Thornfield continued, his voice gentle but insistent. I'm hoping you might be able to help us locate this piece so that we can complete our authentication process. I touched the necklace through my blouse, feeling the familiar weight of the pendant against my chest. The simple blue stone that my family had mocked as obviously fake, the setting that my uncle had dismissed as silver-plated copper, the piece that had made me the subject of family ridicule just 5 days earlier. Why would this particular necklace be important to your authentication process? I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Dr. Thornfield leaned forward slightly, his expression becoming more intense. Because if the piece described in your grandmother's inventory is authentic, it's not just valuable, it's historically significant. Cashmere sapphires of that quality and size are extraordinarily rare. Most of the known pieces are already in major museum collections or private holdings that are well documented. The appearance of a previously unknown piece would be, well, it would be quite remarkable. The room seemed to spin slightly as the implications of what he was saying sank in. The necklace that made me a laughingstock at my cousin's engagement party, the piece my family had used as evidence of my grandmother's naive sentimentality just 5 days earlier, might actually be one of the most valuable pieces of jewelry any of us had ever encountered. How valuable are we talking about? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Thornfield consulted his notes before answering. Comparable cashmere sapphire pieces have sold at auction from anywhere from $200,000 to over $1 million, depending on their provenance, condition, and historical significance. But this particular piece, if it's authentic and if the documentation we found is accurate, could be worth considerably more. The number hit me like a thunderbolt. $1 million. The necklace I wore every day, the piece my family had laughed at, the simple pendant that reminded me of my grandmother's love, could be worth enough money to change my entire life. Miss Whitmore,
Dr. Thornfield said gently, clearly noticing my shock. "Do you happen to have access to the necklace described in your grandmother's inventory?" I reached up and touched the chain around my neck, feeling the weight of 13 years of daily wear, 13 years of treating a potential $1 million artifact as a sentimental keepsake. The irony was so overwhelming that I almost laughed. "I think," I said slowly, "I might be wearing it right now." Dr. Thornfield's eyes widened with professional excitement. "Would you be willing to let me examine it? I want to be very clear that I'm not making any claims about authentication without proper testing, but even a preliminary examination could tell us whether we're looking at the right piece." With trembling fingers, I unclasped the necklace and placed it carefully on the conference table between us. In the fluorescent light of the school office, it looked exactly as it always had. A simple blue stone in a delicate silver setting, pretty but unremarkable. Dr. Thornfield withdrew a small magnifying glass from his jacket pocket and bent over the necklace with the focused attention of someone who knew exactly what to look for. His examination took several minutes, during which he studied not just the stone, but also the metalwork, the clasp, and several tiny details that I had never noticed. When he finally looked up, his expression had changed completely. The professional calm was gone, replaced with something that looked like genuine amazement. "Miss Whitmore," he said carefully, "I'm going to need to ask you to come with me to Manhattan for a proper authentication process. Because based on what I can see here, your grandmother's inventory may have been remarkably accurate."
The world seemed to tilt sideways. Everything I thought I knew about my grandmother, my family, and my own life was suddenly called into question. The woman who had been dismissed as sentimental and naive had apparently been hiding secrets that none of us had ever suspected. "Dr. Thornfield," I said, my voice shaking slightly, "what exactly did my grandmother do? How did she come to own something like this?" His expression became more serious, almost concerned. "That's what we're hoping to determine through our research. The documentation we found suggests that your grandmother was involved in what we might call acquisition and preservation activities for several decades. Some of the pieces in the safety deposit box have histories that are complex." The way he said complex sent another chill through me. I was beginning to understand that my grandmother's secrets might involve more than just valuable jewelry. There might be questions about how these pieces had been acquired, where they had come from, and whether their ownership histories were completely legitimate. "Miss Whitmore, I want to be completely transparent with you." Dr. Thornfield continued, "If this necklace is what we think it might be, its authentication could open up a much larger investigation into your grandmother's activities. There may be claims from other parties, questions about provenance, and legal complications that could take years to resolve." I stared down at the necklace, lying on the table, this simple piece that had just transformed from a sentimental keepsake into the center of what sounded like a potential legal and financial maze. The family who had mocked it as worthless costume jewelry had no idea that they might have been looking at something that could change all of our lives. But beneath my shock and confusion, I felt something else beginning to grow. A fierce protectiveness of my grandmother's memory and a determination to understand the truth about the woman who had shaped my understanding of beauty and value. Whatever secrets Rosalind Whitmore had kept, whatever complicated history surrounded this necklace, I was going to face it head on. "Dr. Thornfield," I said, my voice growing steadier, "when do we leave for Manhattan?" The train ride to Manhattan gave me 3 hours to process what was happening to my life, but it felt like trying to solve a puzzle while the pieces kept multiplying in my hands. Dr. Thornfield had arranged for a substitute teacher to cover my classes for the rest of the week, citing a family emergency requiring immediate attention, which I was beginning to realize might be the understatement of the century. As the Hudson Valley countryside flashed past the window, I found myself studying the necklace with new eyes. I had carefully placed it in a small padded jewelry box that Dr. Thornfield had provided, but even knowing it might be worth a fortune, I couldn't quite believe it. The piece looked exactly as it always had.
Beautiful in its simplicity, but nothing that screamed museum-quality artifact to my untrained eye. Dr. Thornfield spent much of the journey making phone calls, speaking in the careful language of experts who dealt with sensitive discoveries. I caught fragments of conversations about authentication protocols, provenance verification, and potential international implications that made my stomach churn with anxiety about what I was walking into. When we finally arrived at Rothwell Associates, I was overwhelmed by the sheer sophistication of the operation. The auction house occupied an entire building on East 79th Street, its exterior giving no hint of the treasures housed within. The lobby was marble and mahogany, lined with cases displaying pieces that looked like they belonged in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Dr. Thornfield led me through a maze of offices and examination rooms to what he called the authentication laboratory, a space that looked more like a high-tech medical facility than anything I had expected. Microscopes, spectrometers, and computer equipment filled workstations where specialists in white coats examined objects with scientific precision. As we get you acquainted, I'd like to examine what we suspect to be a cashmere sapphire, Dr. Fairchild explained as she adjusted the microscope's focus. We need to be sure that this cashmere sapphire has no unique features. As she worked, Professor Hawkins spread out documents on a nearby table, copies of the papers that had been found in my grandmother's safety deposit box. What I saw there made me question everything I thought I knew about Rosalind Whitmore. The documents included correspondence with auction houses in London, Paris, and Geneva, letters discussing acquisitions and private sales written in my grandmother's careful handwriting, certificates of authenticity for pieces I had never seen, and most disturbingly of all, what appeared to be insurance valuations for a collection worth millions of dollars. Your grandmother, he said gently, noticing my shock, has apparently been operating what we might call a quiet collection for several decades. This was actually quite common among wealthy collectors who preferred to keep their activities private. But she wasn't wealthy, I protested. She lived in a modest house in Millbrook Heights. She drove an old car. She shopped at department stores, not exclusive boutiques.
Professor Hawkins exchanged a glance with Dr. Thornfield before responding. Miss Whitmore, many of the most serious collectors in the world live exactly as you describe. Wealth that's tied up in portable, valuable assets often doesn't translate into ostentatious lifestyle choices. In fact, discretion is usually preferable when you're dealing with pieces that might attract unwanted attention. Dr. Fairchild's voice interrupted our conversation from across the room. Dr. Thornfield, you need to see this. Her tone carried an excitement that made everyone freeze. The inclusions are absolutely consistent with cashmere origin. The color saturation is exceptional. And look at this. She adjusted the monitor to show a microscopic view of the stone's interior. These silk inclusions are textbook cashmere characteristics. What does that mean exactly? I asked, though I was beginning to suspect the answer would be overwhelming. It means, Dr. Fairchild said, looking up from the microscope with genuine amazement, that your grandmother's inventory description was not only accurate, but possibly conservative. This is definitely a cashmere sapphire, probably somewhere between 8 and 10 carats, and the quality is extraordinary. Professor Hawkins was studying the setting under a separate magnifying device. The metalwork is definitely hand-forged platinum, probably European craftsmanship from the 1920s. There are maker's marks here that I'll need to research, but the quality is consistent with major jewelry houses of that period. Are we talking about the kind of money Dr. Thornfield mentioned? Hundreds of thousands? More? The two experts exchanged another look before Dr. Fairchild answered. Based on what I'm seeing here, and considering comparable pieces that have sold at auction in recent years, this necklace could easily be worth between $800,000 and $1.2 million, possibly more if we can establish a prestigious provenance. The number hit me like a physical blow. I sank into a nearby chair, trying to process the reality that I had been wearing more than $1 million around my neck every day for 13 years. That I had been mocked by my family for wearing what might be one of the most valuable pieces of jewelry any of them had ever encountered. "There's something else we need to discuss," Professor Hawkins said, his tone becoming more serious. "Based on the documentation we found, this necklace may have a rather complicated history. Some of the papers suggest that your grandmother acquired it during what she called a European acquisition trip in 1962. What's complicated about that?" I asked, though I was beginning to learn that when these experts used words like complicated, it usually meant something that would give me sleepless nights. 1962 was a period when many valuable pieces were still surfacing from the disruptions of World War II, Professor Hawkins explained carefully. There were legitimate sales, of course, but there were also pieces that had been displaced during the war years. Establishing clear ownership history can be challenging for items from that era. The implication of what he was saying slowly sunk in. There might be questions about whether my grandmother had legally acquired the necklace. There might be other people, or their descendants, who had legitimate claims to it. The fortune I had just discovered might not actually be mine to claim. "What does that mean for me?" I asked. "What happens now?" Dr. Thornfield consulted his notes before answering. "We have several steps ahead of us. First, we need to complete the full authentication process, which will take several more days and involve additional testing. Second, we need to research the provenance thoroughly, which means tracing the necklace's ownership history as far back as possible. Third, we need to determine whether there are any outstanding claims or legal issues that might affect ownership. And in the meantime? In the meantime, the necklace will need to remain here for safekeeping and continued testing. I know that's difficult, given its sentimental value, but pieces of this significance require special security and insurance coverage. The thought of being separated from my grandmother's necklace, even temporarily, felt like losing her all over again. But I was beginning to understand that the simple, sentimental relationship I had with the piece was over, forever. Whether it ultimately belonged to me or not, it could never again be just a cherished keepsake. Dr. Fairchild had been quietly continuing her examination while we talked, and she suddenly looked up with an expression of surprise. "There's something else here that you need to see," she said, adjusting the microscope to focus on the necklace's clasp. There appeared to be very small engravings on the inside of the setting, letters or numbers that might be significant. We all gathered around the monitor as she focused on what looked like tiny scratches on the metal. As the image sharpened, I could make out what appeared to be initials and numbers. RW 1962, and below that, something that looked like VH 1920. RW would presumably be your grandmother, Rosalind Whitmore, Professor Hawkins said. The date 1962 matches the time frame of her European trip. But these other initials... He paused, studying the image more carefully. VH 1920. That might indicate a previous owner and the year they acquired it. "Is there any way to research those initials?" I asked. "We can certainly try. Records from that period can be challenging to access, but there are databases of jewelry ownership, insurance records, and estate inventories that might give us leads." As the afternoon wore on, the full scope of what I was facing became clear. This wasn't just about discovering that I owned something valuable. This was about uncovering a hidden chapter of my grandmother's life that might involve international art markets, complex legal questions, and family secrets that had been buried for decades.
The experts continued their work, photographing every detail of the necklace, recording measurements, and conducting tests that would verify its authenticity beyond any doubt. I watched them handle the piece that had been my daily companion with scientific detachment, and I felt a profound sadness at the loss of its simplicity. But underneath the sadness, something else was growing. A fierce curiosity about the woman who had raised me to appreciate beauty and value, who had apparently lived a secret life that none of her family had suspected. Grandmother Rosalind had been far more sophisticated and mysterious than any of us had ever imagined, and I was determined to understand the truth about her legacy. "Dr. Thornfield," I said as the afternoon session concluded, "I want to know everything, whatever it takes, however complicated it gets. I want to understand who my grandmother really was and how she came to own something like this." He nodded approvingly. "I was hoping you'd say that, Miss Whitmore, because based on what we've discovered today, I suspect your grandmother's story is going to be far more interesting than any of us anticipated." As I prepared to return to Riverdale that evening, leaving the necklace behind for the first time in 13 years, I realized that my old life as a simple art teacher was effectively over. Whatever came next, whether the necklace ultimately belonged to me or not, I was about to learn truths about my family that would change everything I thought I knew about where I came from and who I was meant to be. The weekend back in Riverdale felt surreal, like living in two different worlds simultaneously. On the surface, I went through the motions of my normal life, grading papers, preparing lesson plans, and shopping for groceries at the corner market, where Mrs. Chen always asked about my week. But underneath, my mind was constantly spinning with the implications of what I'd discovered in Manhattan. Saturday morning brought an unexpected ally when my doorbell rang at 9 o'clock. I opened it to find Amelia Richardson, the head librarian at Millbrook Heights Public Library, standing on my doorstep with a cardboard box and an expression of barely contained excitement. "Cassandra, dear, I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced," though her tone suggested this was anything but a casual visit. "But after I heard about your visit to that auction house, and yes, word travels fast in our community, I realized I might have something that could help you." Amelia had been my grandmother's closest friend outside the family, though I hadn't seen much of her since grandmother Rosalind's funeral. She was a woman in her 70s with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of meticulous attention to detail that made her legendary among local researchers. "How did you hear about the auction house?" I asked, inviting her in. "Dr. Thornfield called the library yesterday asking about historical records related to your grandmother. When the reference desk told him I had been Rosalind's friend, he requested a meeting. That's when I realized it was time to share something your grandmother entrusted to me years ago." The box contained what appeared to be a lifetime's worth of correspondence, photographs, and documents that my grandmother had apparently kept separate from the family's knowledge. As Amelia carefully removed items from the box, I began to see a completely different picture of Rosalind Whitmore's life. "Your grandmother didn't want the family to know about her collecting activities," Amelia explained, spreading out photographs of jewelry pieces that were clearly museum quality. She felt they wouldn't understand her passion for preserving beautiful things, and she was probably right. But she also knew that someday someone in the family might need to understand the truth about her legacy. The photographs showed dozens of pieces, necklaces, brooches, rings, and bracelets that were obviously valuable and historically significant. Each photo was labeled in my grandmother's handwriting with details about origin, date of acquisition, and sometimes cryptic notes about special circumstances or rescue situations. "What does she mean by rescue situations?" I asked, pointing to a notation on a photograph of an elaborate Art Deco bracelet. Amelia's expression became more serious. "Your grandmother believed that beautiful objects were part of human heritage, not just private possessions. During her travels in the 1960s and 70s, she encountered many situations where valuable pieces were being neglected, sold under duress, or might otherwise be lost to history. She saw herself as a kind of conservator." The term conservator sounded more noble than collector, but I was beginning to understand that my grandmother's activities might have existed in legal and ethical gray areas that could prove problematic for me now. "Amelia, I need to ask you directly.
Did my grandmother ever acquire pieces that might have been stolen or illegally obtained? Never knowingly, she said firmly. But you have to understand the context of the times. In the decades following World War II, there were countless valuable items floating through European markets with unclear ownership histories. Your grandmother was meticulous about documentation, but even legitimate dealers sometimes couldn't guarantee clean provenance for pieces from that era. She withdrew a leather-bound journal from the box and opened it to reveal pages of my grandmother's careful notes about specific acquisitions. The entries were detailed but written in a kind of personal code that would have been meaningless to anyone who didn't understand her system. She taught me how to read these entries in case something ever happened to her and the family needed to understand her collection. Look here, she pointed to an entry dated June 1962. This describes the acquisition of what she calls the cashmere piece from a dealer in Geneva.
The entry was fascinating and disturbing in equal measure. My grandmother had written about meeting with H. Bergman, dealer in displaced items, about a collection being liquidated under unfortunate circumstances, and about her decision to preserve peace for future generations rather than allow it to disappear into private hands again. What does this mean exactly? I asked, though I was beginning to form my own interpretations that made me uncomfortable. It means your grandmother acquired the necklace from someone who is selling it under pressure. Financial difficulties, family disputes, legal problems. She saw herself as saving it from being broken up or sold to someone who might not appreciate its historical significance. A separate document in the journal caught my attention. What appeared to be a receipt or bill of sale for one sapphire pendant, platinum setting, circa 1920, purchased for 2,400 Swiss francs from H. Bergman Antiquities, Geneva. The amount seems substantial for 1962, though I had no way to judge whether it represented fair market value for the piece. Amelia, this is helpful, but it doesn't really solve the provenance problem that Dr. Thornfield mentioned. If anything, it raises more questions about how the piece ended up with this H. Bergman person. That's where this becomes even more interesting, Amelia said, withdrawing another set of documents from the box. After your grandmother's death, I did some research of my own about the dealers she had worked with. H. Bergman was a legitimate antiquities dealer in Geneva, but he specialized in what was called estate liquidations during the 1960s. The documents Amelia had collected painted a complex picture of the post-war European art and antiquities market. Bergman's business had apparently focused on helping families liquidate valuable collections when they needed quick access to cash, often during immigration, divorce, or financial crisis situations. So the necklace might have belonged to someone who needed to sell it quickly, but not necessarily someone who had stolen it or obtained it illegally. Exactly. But here's what makes your situation particularly interesting. Amelia spread out a series of newspaper clippings and official documents that she had obviously spent considerable time collecting. I found records indicating that several pieces sold through Bergman's operation in the early 1960s were later claimed by families who said they had been forced to sell valuable heirlooms during wartime displacement. The implications of what she was telling me sank in slowly. Even if my grandmother had acquired the necklace legally and in good faith, there might still be families out there who consider it stolen property taken from them during the chaos of World War II and its aftermath. What happened in those cases? Were the claims successful? Mixed results. Some cases were settled through negotiation, some went to lengthy court battles, and some were never resolved. But the important thing for you to understand is that legitimate claims can be made decades after initial sales, especially for items with wartime displacement histories. I stared at the documents spread across my kitchen table, trying to process the reality that my million-dollar inheritance might come with legal complications that could last for years and cost more than the necklace was worth to resolve. Amelia, what would you do if you were in my position? She considered the question carefully before answering. I would be completely transparent with the auction house about everything we've discovered. I would cooperate fully with any provenance research they want to conduct, and I would prepare myself for the possibility that other parties might come forward with claims. And if someone does come forward with a legitimate claim, then you'll have to decide whether fighting for the necklace is worth the cost, financial, emotional, and ethical. Your grandmother would want you to do what feels right, not just what's legally defensible. That afternoon, I called Dr. Thornfield to update him on Amelia's revelations and to share copies of the documents she had brought me. His response was both encouraging and sobering. This additional documentation is extremely helpful, Miss Whitmore. It gives us a much clearer picture of how your grandmother acquired the piece and suggests that she acted in good faith with legitimate dealers. But you're right that it doesn't eliminate all potential complications. What's our next step? We continue the full authentication and provenance research. I'm bringing in a specialist who focuses specifically on post-war European art and jewelry transactions. We'll also be reaching out to international databases that track items with disputed ownership histories. How long will all of this take? Several weeks, possibly longer. I want to be honest with you. This process could become quite complex and potentially expensive if legal challenges arise. You need to decide how far you're willing to go to establish clear ownership. That evening, I sat in my small apartment looking through my grandmother's journal and trying to understand the woman who had lived such a carefully hidden double life. The entries revealed someone who was passionate about preserving beautiful objects, but also someone who understood that her activities existed in morally and legally complex territory. One entry particularly struck me, dated just months before her death. Collection represents lifetime of preservation efforts. Hope family will someday understand that beautiful things deserve protection, even when the circumstances of their preservation are complicated. Value lies not just in money, but in cultural heritage saved for future generations.
I realized that my grandmother had been preparing for exactly this situation. A moment when her family would discover her secrets and have to decide what to do with her complicated legacy. She had trusted me with the necklace, not just because she thought I would appreciate its beauty, but because she believed I would have the strength to handle whatever difficult truths came with it. By Sunday evening, I had made my decision. I would pursue the full authentication and provenance research, regardless of what complications might arise. I would be completely transparent about everything we discovered, even if it raised difficult questions about the necklace's history. And if legitimate claims were made by other parties, I would evaluate them honestly, rather than fighting simply to protect my inheritance. My grandmother had lived her life trying to preserve beautiful things for future generations. The least I could do was ensure that her efforts were handled with the same integrity and care that had motivated her in the first place. Monday morning, I called Dr. Thornfield to confirm my commitment to the full investigation process. Whatever came next, whatever secrets we uncovered about my grandmother's activities, whatever legal complications might arise, I was ready to face them head-on. The simple art teacher who had been mocked for wearing costume jewelry was gone forever. In her place was someone who understood that truth and integrity were worth fighting for, even when the battle might cost more than the prize was worth. 3 weeks after my first visit to Rothwell Associates, Dr. Thornfield called with news that would change everything once again. His voice carried a tension I hadn't heard before, the careful control of someone delivering information that would have far-reaching consequences. Miss Whitmore, we need to meet as soon as possible. Our provenance research has uncovered some developments that require immediate discussion. Can you come to Manhattan tomorrow? The urgency in his tone sent a chill through me. For 3 weeks, I had been living in a strange limbo, teaching my classes while knowing that my life might be fundamentally different depending on what the authentication process revealed. Now it seemed that moment of truth had arrived. Dr. Thornfield, can you give me any indication of what you found? I'd prefer to discuss the details in person, but I will say this.
We've identified the previous owner of the necklace. And Miss Whitmore, that person's family is very much alive and very interested in speaking with you." The words hit me like a physical blow. After weeks of preparing myself for various scenarios, the reality of facing actual people who might have legitimate claims to my inheritance was terrifying and overwhelming. Thursday morning found me once again on the train to Manhattan. But this time I wasn't alone. Amelia Richardson had insisted on accompanying me, bringing with her a briefcase full of additional documents she had uncovered through her own research network. Her presence was both comforting and concerning. Comforting because I trusted her knowledge of my grandmother's activities. Concerning because she felt the need to be there at all. "Cassandra, before we arrive, there's something I need to tell you about your grandmother that I didn't share before," Amelia said as we neared Penn Station. Rosalind didn't just collect beautiful objects randomly. She had a very specific focus on pieces that belonged to families who had been displaced or persecuted during the war years. "What do you mean specifically?" She said many of the items in her collection came from Jewish families who had been forced to sell their possessions during the Holocaust or its aftermath. Your grandmother saw herself as preserving these pieces until they could potentially be returned to their rightful owners or their descendants. The revelation reframed everything I thought I understood about my grandmother's activities. She hadn't simply been a collector driven by aesthetic appreciation. She had been engaging in what amounted to cultural rescue operations, though the legal and ethical implications of her methods were still unclear. Did she ever return pieces to families who came forward? Several times, actually. But she was also realistic about the fact that many families had been completely destroyed, leaving no one to claim their heritage. In those cases, she felt preservation was better than allowing pieces to disappear into anonymous private collections. When we arrived at Rothwell Associates, Dr. Thornfield met us with Dr. Sarah Kellerman, whom he introduced as a specialist in Holocaust asset recovery and restitution cases. Dr. Kellerman was a woman in her 50s, with gray hair and the kind of serious demeanor that suggested she dealt regularly with emotionally complex situations. "Miss Whitmore, thank you for coming. I want to begin by saying that the research we have conducted confirms that your grandmother acquired the necklace through legitimate channels and that there's no evidence of any intentional wrongdoing on her part." The words should have been reassuring, but Dr. Kellerman's tone suggested complications were coming. "However," she continued, "we have been contacted by a family in Vienna whose documentation suggests that the necklace was originally part of their family's collection before it was confiscated by Nazi authorities in 1938. She opened a file and spread out documents that were clearly much older than anything in my grandmother's collection. Marriage certificates, insurance records, and photographs showing a family wearing jewelry that included what was unmistakably my grandmother's necklace.
"The family name is Hirsch," Dr. Kellerman explained. "David and Rebecca Hirsch were prominent jewelry designers in Vienna before the war. They were forced to surrender their personal collection along with their business inventory when they fled Austria in 1938. The necklace you inherited was apparently a piece that David had designed for his wife Rebecca as a 20th wedding anniversary gift." The photographs were devastating in their intimacy. A family portrait from the 1930s showed a woman wearing my necklace at what was clearly a celebration, surrounded by children and grandchildren who were smiling at the camera with no idea of the tragedy that was approaching. "What happened to the family?" I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. "David and Rebecca made it to Switzerland, but they lost 3 of their 4 children in the camps. They spent the rest of their lives trying to track down pieces from their collection, but most were never recovered. David died in 1967, Rebecca in 1974. "So there's no one left to claim it?" Dr. Kellerman shook her head. "That's where this becomes more complex. David and Rebecca's surviving daughter, Sarah Hirsch Weber, emigrated to New York after the war. She's now 89 years old and lives in a care facility in Brooklyn.
Her granddaughter, Rachel Weber, contacted us after seeing our research inquiries in international restitution databases. The reality of what I was facing crashed over me like a wave. There was an 89-year-old woman in Brooklyn who had spent her entire life knowing that her parents' precious anniversary gift was somewhere in the world, probably never expecting to see it again. And now her granddaughter was working to recover family treasures that had been lost for over 80 years. Have they made a formal claim? I asked. Not yet. Rachel Weber has requested a meeting with you first. She wants to understand how your grandmother came to own the piece and whether there might be a way to resolve the situation that honors both families' connections to the necklace. Dr. Thornfield added, Ms. Whitmore, I want to be clear about your legal position. Your grandmother's acquisition appears to have been completely legitimate under the laws of the time. The dealer she purchased from had apparently acquired it through legal channels, though those channels ultimately trace back to Nazi confiscations. You have no legal obligation to return the necklace. But, Dr. Kellerman continued, there are moral and ethical considerations that go beyond legal obligations. This is ultimately a decision that only you can make. Amelia had been silent during this presentation, but now she spoke up. There's something else you need to know about Rosalind's intentions. She left specific instructions with me about what should happen if families ever came forward with legitimate claims to pieces in her collection. She withdrew a sealed envelope from her briefcase, one that bore my name in my grandmother's handwriting. She made me promise to give this to you only if this exact situation arose. With trembling hands, I opened the envelope and read my grandmother's final message about her collection. My dear Cassie, if you are reading this, it means that a family has come forward to claim a piece that I preserved for them. I always hoped this day would come, though I knew it might be after my death. The necklace was never truly mine. I was simply its guardian until it could return home. The choice of what to do now belongs to you, but I hope you will remember that some things are more valuable than money. The greatest treasure I can leave you is the knowledge that beautiful objects should unite families, not divide them. Whatever you decide, I am proud of the woman you have become. Love always, Grandmother Rosalind. The letter brought tears to my eyes, but it also brought a clarity that I hadn't expected. My grandmother had always intended for me to face this decision, and she had trusted me to make the right choice when the time came. Dr. Kellerman, when can I meet with Rachel Weber and her grandmother? They're actually here in Manhattan today. Rachel flew in from California when she learned about the necklace. If you're willing, they're hoping to meet with you this afternoon. The speed with which everything was moving felt overwhelming, but I realized that prolonging the uncertainty wouldn't make the decision any easier. Yes, I'd like to meet with them. There's one more thing you should know before you meet them, Dr. Kellerman said. Rachel Weber is an attorney who specializes in art restitution cases. She's been working for years to recover items that belong to Holocaust victims and their families. The information should have made me nervous about facing someone with legal expertise in exactly the area that affected my situation. Instead, it made me respect her dedication to reuniting families with their lost heritage. That afternoon, I found myself in a conference room at Rothwell Associates, preparing to meet the people who had the strongest moral claim to the necklace that had defined my relationship with my grandmother for 13 years. Through the window, I could see the bustling activity of East 79th Street, people going about their normal lives, while I prepared for a conversation that would determine whether I was about to lose $1 million and gain something far more valuable, the knowledge that I had done the right thing. Amelia had been silent during this presentation, but now she spoke up. There's something else you need to know about Rosalind's intentions. She left specific instructions with me about what should happen if families ever came forward with legitimate claims to pieces in her collection. She withdrew a sealed envelope from her briefcase, one that bore my name in my grandmother's handwriting. She made me promise to give this to you only if this exact situation arose. With trembling hands, I opened the envelope and read my grandmother's final message about her collection. My dear Cassie, if you are reading this, it means that a family has come forward to claim a piece that I preserved for them. I always hoped this day would come, though I knew it might be after my death. The necklace was never truly mine. I was simply its guardian until it could return home. The choice of what to do now belongs to you, but I hope you will remember that some things are more valuable than money. The greatest treasure I can leave you is the knowledge that beautiful objects should unite families, not divide them. Whatever you decide, I am proud of the woman you have become. Love always, Grandmother Rosalind.
In a few minutes, I would meet Sarah Hirsch Weber, the woman who had lost her siblings to the Holocaust and spent her life in America knowing that her parents' treasures were scattered across the world. I would meet her granddaughter Rachel, who had dedicated her career to recovering lost family heritage for people like her grandmother. And then, I would have to decide whether preserving my own inheritance was worth denying an 89-year-old woman the chance to hold her mother's anniversary gift one more time before she died. The necklace that had started as a symbol of my grandmother's love was about to become a test of the values she had tried to teach me about what truly mattered in life. As I heard footsteps approaching the conference room, I realized that this meeting would determine not just the fate of a valuable piece of jewelry, but also who I was going to be when faced with the most important moral decision of my life. When the conference room door opened, the first person I saw was Rachel Weber, a woman in her 40s with dark hair and intelligent eyes that immediately assessed everyone in the room with professional efficiency. But it was the elderly woman beside her who took my breath away. Sarah Hirsch Weber moved slowly with the aid of a walker, but her posture carried a dignity that spoke of a lifetime of surviving unimaginable hardships. The family resemblance was unmistakable when I looked at the 1930s photographs Dr. Kellerman had shown me earlier. Sarah had her mother Rebecca's bone structure and the same elegant way of holding her head that I had noticed in the vintage family portraits. But what struck me most was her eyes. They held the kind of deep sadness that comes from losing everything and everyone you love, combined with a strength that had somehow endured for nearly 9 decades. "Miss Whitmore," Rachel said, extending her hand with a firm grip. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with us. This is my grandmother, Sarah Hirsch Weber." Sarah looked directly at me with an intensity that was both gentle and piercing. When she spoke, her voice carried the faint trace of an Austrian accent that 8 decades in America hadn't completely erased. "You are the young woman who has been wearing my mother's necklace," she said. It wasn't a question or an accusation, simply a statement of fact delivered with the matter-of-factness of someone who had learned to accept the impossible twists that life could take. "Yes, ma'am. I've been wearing it every day for 13 years, since my grandmother left it to me. I had no idea of its history until last week." Sarah nodded slowly, as if she had expected this answer. "Your grandmother, she was a good woman." The question caught me off guard with its directness and its underlying assumption that the character of the person who had possessed her mother's necklace mattered as much as the legal facts of ownership. "She was the best woman I've ever known. She taught me to appreciate beautiful things and to see value in places where others might not look." Then she understood why my mother treasured this piece so much. Sarah's voice carried a warmth that I hadn't expected. May I see it?" Dr. Thornfield had prepared for this moment, bringing the necklace from the secure storage where it had been kept during the authentication process. He carefully removed it from its protective case and placed it on the conference table where Sarah could see it clearly. The change in Sarah's expression was immediate and profound. Her eyes filled with tears, but her face also lit up with a joy that transformed her features completely. She reached out with trembling fingers, stopping just short of touching the pendant. "Mein Gott," she whispered in lapsing into German. "It is exactly as I remember. My father spent months designing it for my mother's anniversary. Every detail was planned to represent their love story." Rachel moved closer to her grandmother, providing support as Sarah studied the necklace with the intensity of someone trying to absorb 75 years of separation in a single moment. "Grandmother, would you like to tell Miss Whitmore about the necklace's significance to your family?" Sarah nodded, collecting herself before speaking. "My father, David, he was master jeweler in Vienna. This necklace,
He made it special for my mother, Rebecca, when they celebrated 20 years of marriage in 1937. The stone, it came from Kashmir. My father saved for 2 years to afford it. The setting, he designed it himself with symbols that meant something to their relationship. She pointed to tiny details in the metalwork that I had never noticed despite wearing the piece for 13 years. These little flowers here, they are forget-me-nots, because my mother always said she would never forget the day they met. And this pattern along the edge, it represents the mountains where they spent their honeymoon in Switzerland. Hearing the personal history behind every element of the necklace's design made me realize how much meaning I had been carrying around my neck without ever understanding it. This wasn't just a valuable piece of jewelry, it was a love story made tangible, a testament to a couple's devotion that had been crafted to last forever.
Your parents must have been devastated when they were forced to give it up, I said. They never spoke of it, Sarah replied. After we came to America, we learned not to talk about what we had lost. It hurt too much, and there was nothing to be done about it. But my mother, she would sometimes touch her throat where the necklace used to rest, especially when she was thinking about my brothers and sister who did not survive. The weight of the Holocaust's impact on this family settled over the room like a heavy blanket. I began to understand that the necklace represented far more than monetary value. It was one of the last tangible connections to family members who had been murdered and to a life that had been completely destroyed. Miss Whitmore, Rachel said, I want you to understand that we're not here to take anything away from you by force. We recognize that your grandmother acquired the necklace legally and that you have every legal right to keep it. Then why are you here? I asked, though I was beginning to understand the answer. Because, Sarah said, her voice growing stronger, some things are more important than legal rights. This necklace represents my parents' love, my family's history, and the memory of people who can no longer speak for themselves. She paused, studying my face carefully before continuing. But I also understand that it represents your connection to your grandmother and your own family history. This is not a simple situation with easy answers. The honesty and complexity of Sarah's response surprised me. I had expected demands, legal threats, or emotional manipulation. Instead, I was facing a woman who understood that multiple people could have legitimate claims to the same object for different but equally valid reasons. What would you like to see happen? I asked. Rachel spoke first. Ideally, we would love for the necklace to return to our family. My grandmother is 89 years old, and having the chance to hold her mother's anniversary gift again would mean everything to her. But we also understand the position this puts you in. There might be other solutions, Dr. Kellerman interjected. In some restitution cases, families work out arrangements that acknowledge everyone's interests. What kind of arrangements? I asked. Sometimes the current owner retains legal ownership, but agrees to loan pieces to families for specific periods. Sometimes there are financial arrangements where families purchase pieces back at fair market value. Sometimes pieces are donated to museums where families can visit them and their stories can be preserved for future generations. I looked at Sarah, trying to imagine what it would be like to discover that something precious from my murdered family members was in the hands of a stranger, even a well-meaning stranger. The thought was heartbreaking. Sarah, I said, addressing her directly, if you were in my position, what would you do? She was quiet for a long moment, clearly considering her words carefully before continuing. If I were you, I would remember that your grandmother was apparently a woman who collected beautiful things because she understood their importance to families and to history. I would ask myself what she would want me to do in this situation. The answer hit me like a lightning bolt. I thought about my grandmother's letter, about her work preserving items from families who had been displaced, about her belief that beautiful objects should unite families rather than divide them. I thought about the woman who had taught me that the value of something wasn't measured only in money, but in the love and meaning it carried. Dr. Thornfield, I said, my voice steadier than I felt, what's the current estimated value of the necklace?
Based on our complete authentication, we're looking at approximately $1.1 million at auction. I turned back to Sarah and Rachel. Would your family be able to purchase the necklace if it were offered to you at significantly below market value? Rachel looked surprised by the question. We could arrange something depending on the price, but Miss Whitmore, we don't expect you to sell it to us below market value. What if I told you I wasn't interested in selling it at all? The room fell silent as everyone tried to understand what I was suggesting. What if I told you that after learning about your family's history and understanding what this necklace means to your grandmother, I've decided that keeping it would be wrong? Sarah's eyes widened with disbelief. You would return it to us? I would return it to where it belongs, but I would ask for one thing in return. Anything, Rachel said immediately. I would want to maintain some connection to the necklace and its story. Maybe visiting rights to see it occasionally, or copies of the family photos that show your mother wearing it. I've loved this piece for 13 years, and I would want to still be part of its story somehow. Sarah began to cry, not tears of sadness, but tears of joy that seemed to come from a place so deep that she might not have accessed it in decades. She reached across the table and took my hands in her trembling ones. Child, you would give up $1 million for an old woman you met an hour ago?
I would give up $1 million to honor my grandmother's memory and to make sure your family's love story continues instead of ending with me. The emotional impact of my decision hit everyone in the room simultaneously. Dr. Thornfield looked stunned, Dr. Kellerman appeared deeply moved, and Amelia was wiping tears from her eyes. But it was Rachel's response that surprised me most. Miss Whitmore, what you're offering is incredibly generous, but I can't let you walk away from this empty-handed. The necklace is worth a fortune, and you'll need legal documentation to ensure that your decision is binding and that you're protected from any future complications. I don't need protection from anything, I said. I need to sleep at night knowing I did the right thing. Sarah squeezed my hands tighter. Then we will make sure that you are always part of this necklace's story. You will be the woman who brought it home when it had been lost for 75 years. That is worth more than money. As Dr. Thornfield began discussing the legal procedures for transferring ownership, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't expected. The necklace that had started as my grandmother's gift was becoming something even more precious, a bridge between families, a testament to the power of doing what's right over what's profitable, and a way to honor the memory of people who had suffered unimaginable losses. The woman who had been mocked by her family for wearing costume jewelry was about to give away $1 million inheritance. And for the first time in my life, I knew with absolute certainty that I was making a decision my grandmother would be proud of. The legal paperwork took 3 hours to complete. As Dr. Thornfield and Rachel Weber worked through the complexities of transferring ownership of a $1 million artifact with Holocaust restitution implications, I found myself in the strange position of watching my inheritance disappear with each signature I provided. The process was more intricate than I had anticipated. Beyond the simple transfer of ownership, there were insurance considerations, authentication documentation that needed to accompany the piece, and legal protections that Rachel insisted on including to ensure that my decision couldn't be challenged or reversed by other family members who might question my judgment. Miss Whitmore, Rachel said as she reviewed the final documents, I want you to understand that this transfer is irrevocable. Once these papers are signed, you have no legal claim to the necklace or its value. Are you absolutely certain this is what you want to do? I looked across the room where Sarah sat, holding the necklace for the first time in 75 years, her fingers tracing the forget-me-not pattern that her father had designed to represent her parents' love story. The expression on her face was worth more than any amount of money could ever be. I'm certain, I said, signing the final document.
But certainty didn't prevent the emotional complexity of what I had just done from hitting me in waves over the following hours. As we prepared to leave Rothwell and Associates, I felt a strange mixture of peace, loss, and anxiety about how I was going to explain this decision to my family. Sarah insisted on giving me something before we parted ways. From her purse, she withdrew a small velvet jewelry box that clearly held significant meaning for her. "This belonged to my mother also," she said, opening the box to reveal a simple gold bracelet with a tiny charm in the shape of a heart. "It is not valuable like the necklace, but it was the first piece of jewelry my father ever gave to my mother when they were courting. I have worn it every day since she died, but I want you to have it." "Sarah, I can't take something that means so much to you." "You can and you will," she said, with the firmness of someone who had survived more tragedy than most people could imagine. "This bracelet represents the beginning of my parents' love story. The necklace represented their mature love after 20 years of marriage. You have returned their mature love to our family. Now you should carry the symbol of where their love began." The weight of the simple gold bracelet around my wrist felt heavier than the cashmere sapphire necklace ever had. It represented not just Sarah's gratitude, but also my connection to a story that was now permanently part of my own history. The train ride back to Riverdale gave me time to process what I had done and to prepare for the conversations that lay ahead. Amelia sat beside me, occasionally squeezing my hand, but mostly allowing me to work through my emotions in silence. "Do you regret it?" she finally asked as we neared our station. "No," I said immediately, surprised by how firmly I felt that answer. "But I'm terrified about telling my family." "Because they'll think you're crazy for giving away $1 million?" "Because they'll never understand that some things are more valuable than money. They'll see this as proof that I'm naive and impractical, just like they always said about grandmother Rosalind." That evening, I called my parents to ask if I could come to Sunday dinner a day early. I needed to tell them about the necklace, my decision, and what I had learned about my grandmother before word reached them through other family members. My parents' reaction was even worse than I had anticipated. My father, Robert, listened to my explanation in stunned silence before exploding with an anger I had rarely seen from him. "Cassandra, what have you done? Do you understand that you just gave away enough money to secure your entire financial future? Enough money to buy a house, to pay off your student loans, to ensure that you never have to worry about retirement?"
My mother, Catherine, was equally upset but expressed it through tears rather than shouting. "Sweetheart, I understand that you were moved by this woman's story, but there were other options. You could have sold the necklace and donated part of the proceeds to Holocaust education. You could have arranged for the family to purchase it at a reduced price. You didn't have to give away everything." "It wasn't mine to sell," I tried to explain. "Once I learned its real history, keeping it would have been like stealing from that family." "But your grandmother left it to you legally," my father insisted. "She wanted you to have it, to benefit from it. By giving it away, you've dishonored her intentions." This accusation stung more than the criticism of my financial judgment. The suggestion that I had betrayed my grandmother's trust by following what I believed were her deeper values created a pain that was difficult to bear. "Dad, if you had seen that 89-year-old woman holding her mother's anniversary gift for the first time since she was 14 years old, you would understand that I honored Grandmother Rosalind's intentions perfectly. What I understand is that my daughter has been manipulated by strangers into making a decision that will affect her for the rest of her life." The conversation continued for over an hour, with my parents alternating between anger, disappointment, and genuine concern for my financial future. Nothing I said about the moral implications of keeping Holocaust-looted jewelry seemed to register with them as more important than the practical implications of giving away $1 million inheritance. When I finally left their house that evening, I felt more isolated from my family than ever before. But I also felt a clarity about my own values that I had never experienced.
The gap between what my family considered important and what I considered important had become unbridgeable. Monday morning brought another challenge when I had to explain to Principal Martinez why I needed additional time off to handle family legal matters. The conversation was complicated by the fact that I couldn't tell him the full story without revealing information about the necklace that might become public knowledge before I was ready. Ms. Whitmore, I need to ask if these legal matters are likely to affect your ability to continue teaching. Should I be looking for a permanent replacement for you? The question forced me to confront something I hadn't fully considered. My decision to return the necklace had been made based on moral principles, but it also had practical consequences that I was only beginning to understand. Without the financial security that the necklace could have provided, I would need to continue teaching, continue living in my small apartment, and continue struggling with the same financial pressures that had defined my adult life. No, sir, I'll definitely be continuing to teach. These legal matters are being resolved, and I expect to be back to my normal schedule by next week. That afternoon, I received a phone call that reminded me why I had made the right decision, despite its cost. Rachel Leber called to tell me that her grandmother had spent the entire previous day showing the necklace to nurses and other residents at her care facility, telling anyone who would listen about the young woman who had returned her mother's most precious possession. Ms. Whitmore, I've never seen my grandmother this happy. She's been calling relatives across the country to tell them about the necklace's return. Family members who haven't spoken to each other in years are planning to come visit her just to see it and hear the story. How is she handling having it back after all these years? She's been wearing it constantly, even to sleep. The nurses are a little concerned, but her doctor says that if it makes her happy, there's no medical reason she can't wear it. She keeps saying that she can feel her mother's presence again. The conversation reminded me that my decision had consequences beyond my own financial situation. Sarah Hirschweber was experiencing a joy and connection to her family history that wouldn't have been possible if I had chosen to keep the necklace for its monetary value. Tuesday brought news that made my family's criticism even more intense. Dr. Thornfield called to inform me that the story of the necklace's return had been picked up by several media outlets that specialized in Holocaust restitution stories. Ms. Whitmore, I wanted to give you advanced warning that your decision is attracting some public attention. The combination of the necklace's value, its Holocaust history, and your choice to return it without compensation has made it a compelling human interest story. What kind of attention? There's going to be an article in the New York Times this weekend, and I've had calls from several television news programs. You're under no obligation to participate in any interviews, but you should be prepared for some public interest in what you've done. The thought of public attention was terrifying. I had made my decision based on personal moral convictions, not because I wanted to be celebrated or criticized by strangers. But I was beginning to understand that acts of conscience don't always remain private matters. When my cousin Beatrice called that evening, I knew that word of my decision had reached the extended Whitmore family network. Cassie, what is this insanity I'm hearing about you giving away $1 million necklace? Frederick says you've lost your mind, and Aunt Delilah is convinced you've been brainwashed by some kind of con artists.
The conversation that followed was a painful reminder of how differently my family and I viewed the world. Beatrice couldn't understand why I hadn't at least negotiated some kind of financial arrangement that would have benefited me while still helping the Holocaust survivors' family. You could have kept half the value and still been incredibly generous, she insisted. Or you could have arranged for them to pay you a finder's fee, something that acknowledged your sacrifice while still doing the right thing. Beatrice, once I understood that the necklace had been stolen from a family during the Holocaust, keeping any of its value would have felt like profiting from other people's suffering. But you're not responsible for what happened during the Holocaust. You inherited that necklace legally, and you had every right to benefit from it. The conversation crystallized something important for me. My family was focused on my legal rights and my financial loss. I was focused on what felt morally right, regardless of legal technicalities or financial consequences. The gap between these two perspectives was too wide to bridge through explanation or argument.
That night, I sat in my small apartment above Mrs. Chen's bakery, wearing Sarah's mother's simple gold bracelet and thinking about the choices that had brought me to this point. I had given away $1 million, disappointed my family, and potentially exposed myself to public scrutiny that I never wanted. But I had also returned a Holocaust survivor's most precious family heirloom, honored my grandmother's true values, and learned something important about who I was when faced with the most difficult moral decision of my life. The financial security that the necklace could have provided was gone forever, but the knowledge that I had chosen integrity over money was something that no amount of family criticism or public attention could take away from me. As I prepared for bed, touching the simple heart charm on Sarah's bracelet, I realized that I had gained something far more valuable than financial security. I had gained the certainty that when faced with a choice between profit and principle, I was the kind of person who would choose principle every time. That knowledge was worth more than any necklace could ever be. 6 months after returning the necklace to the Hirsch family, I found myself in a place I had never expected to be. The New York Times article about the restitution had led to opportunities I could never have imagined, while simultaneously cementing my estrangement from much of my extended family in ways that were both painful and liberating. The article, titled "Teacher Returns $1 Million Holocaust Heirloom Without Compensation," had generated responses from around the world. Letters arrived daily at the school from people sharing their own stories of family treasures lost during wartime, refugees thanking me for honoring their experiences, and historians documenting similar cases of voluntary restitution. But the response that mattered most came from Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, director of the Museum of Holocaust History in Washington, D.C. She had called 3 weeks after the article's publication with a proposal that would change the entire trajectory of my career. Ms. Whitmore, your background in art education, combined with your demonstrated understanding of the emotional significance of cultural artifacts, makes you an ideal candidate for a position we're creating. We're looking for someone to head our new Family Heritage Recovery Program, helping families locate and reclaim artifacts that were displaced during the Holocaust and other genocides. The position offered more than just a career change. It offered the opportunity to turn my decision about the necklace into meaningful work that could help other families experience what Sarah Hirschweber had experienced when she held her mother's anniversary gift again. The salary was modest compared to what the necklace could have provided, but it was enough to support a comfortable life while doing work that felt deeply purposeful. More importantly, it validated my belief that choosing principle over profit could lead to opportunities that money alone could never create. My first case at the museum involved a family in Chicago whose grandmother's wedding ring had surfaced at an estate sale in Phoenix. The ring had been confiscated when the family was deported from Hungary in 1944, and 3 generations had believed it was lost forever. When I placed it in the granddaughter's hands 68 years after it had been stolen, I understood why my grandmother had dedicated her life to preserving beautiful objects for the families who loved them. The work wasn't always successful. Many items I researched led to dead ends. Families that had been completely destroyed, or legal complications that prevented reunification. But the cases that did result in happy reunions made every frustrating moment worthwhile. My relationship with my immediate family gradually improved as they began to understand that my decision had led to a career that fulfilled me in ways that teaching, however meaningful, never quite had. My mother, Catherine, was the first to admit that she had been wrong to focus only on the financial loss. "I see how happy this work makes you," she said during one of our Sunday dinners. "You have a sense of purpose that goes beyond just earning a living. I still think you could have found a way to help that family while keeping some financial benefit for yourself, but I understand why you made the choice you did." My father took longer to come around. But even he eventually acknowledged that my career change had worked out better than anyone could have predicted. You found a way to turn one act of generosity into a lifetime of meaningful work. That's not something everyone can do.
The extended family was a different story. Aunt Delilah never spoke to me again after the Times article came out, viewing my decision as a betrayal of family values and a public embarrassment. Frederick and his wife continued to treat me with barely concealed condescension, convinced that my choice proved their long-held beliefs about my impracticality. But, surprisingly, it was my cousin Beatrice who provided the most thoughtful response to my decision. 6 months after our initial phone argument, she called to tell me something that changed my understanding of family dynamics entirely. Cassie, I need to tell you something about the night of my engagement party. I was so caught up in the social aspects of the event that I didn't really process what was happening when everyone was making fun of your necklace. Beatrice, you don't need to apologize for that. No one knew what it really was. That's not what I'm calling about. I'm calling because I realized something about grandmother Rosalind that night, something I should have understood years ago. She paused, clearly gathering her thoughts before continuing. Do you remember how she used to tell us stories about her travels, about the people she met and the things she saw? We always thought she was just being sentimental, sharing random memories from an old woman who had too much time on her hands. I remember. She had wonderful stories. They weren't random memories, Cassie. They were stories about the families she had helped, the artifacts she had preserved, the connections she had made while protecting pieces of cultural heritage. We were too focused on material success to understand that she was describing one of the most meaningful careers any of us could imagine. The realization that my grandmother had been trying to share her true life's work with her family, only to have it dismissed as elderly rambling, was both heartbreaking and illuminating. She had been doing exactly what I was now doing, but without any recognition or support from the people who should have valued her contributions most. Beatrice, why are you telling me this now? Because I want you to know that some of us understand what you did, even if we didn't understand it at first. You didn't just return a necklace to its rightful owners, you honored Grandmother Rosalind's real legacy in a way that none of the rest of us were wise enough to do. The conversation with Beatrice helped heal some of the pain I had been carrying about family relationships. Knowing that at least one family member understood the deeper significance of my choice made the ongoing criticism from others easier to bear. My correspondence with the Hirsch-Weber family had continued throughout the months since the necklace's return. Rachel sent regular updates about her grandmother's health and spirits, always emphasizing how much the necklace's return had meant to the entire extended family. Grandmother wears it every day, Rachel wrote in one letter. She says it gives her strength and helps her feel connected to her parents and siblings in ways she hadn't experienced since she was a teenager. Several family members who had been estranged have reconnected over their shared interest in family history, and we're working on documenting more stories from the survivors in our family. The most meaningful letter came from Sarah herself, written in careful handwriting that showed her determination to communicate directly despite her age. Dear Cassandra, I think of you every time I touch my mother's necklace. You gave me more than a piece of jewelry. You gave me back my connection to the people I lost and the life that was taken from us. But more than that, you showed me that there are still people in the world who believe that doing right is more important than personal gain. This gives me hope for future generations. Your friend always, Sarah. The simple gold bracelet Sarah had given me never left my wrist. It served as a daily reminder that material objects derive their value from the love and history they carry, not from their monetary worth. Colleagues at the museum often asked about its significance, and it became a way to share the story that had transformed my understanding of what it means to inherit something precious. A year after returning the necklace, I received news that brought both joy and sadness. Rachel called to tell me that Sarah had passed away peacefully in her sleep, wearing her mother's necklace. She was 90 years old and had spent her final year reconnected to her family's history in ways that wouldn't have been possible without the necklace's return. She died happy, Rachel told me. For the first time since the war,
She felt like her family was complete because she had her mother's most precious possession back where it belonged. The funeral was held in Brooklyn, and Rachel invited me to attend as an honorary family member. Standing in the synagogue, listening to stories about Sarah's life of resilience and strength, I understood that my decision to return the necklace had been about more than just doing the right thing. It had been about honoring the connections between past and present, between families separated by tragedy and time.
At the reception after the service, several of Sarah's relatives approached me to share their own stories of lost family treasures and their gratitude for what I had done for their grandmother. One great niece, a woman about my age named Rebecca, who had been named after Sarah's mother, asked if she could stay in touch with me about other potential restitution cases. Sarah always said you understood something about the importance of family heritage that most people miss, Rebecca said. She would want that understanding to help other families if possible. This conversation led to my involvement in several additional restitution cases outside my official museum work. Families began contacting me directly when they discovered artifacts that might belong to others, seeking advice about how to handle complicated ownership questions with integrity and sensitivity. Each case taught me something new about the complexity of cultural heritage, the persistence of family connections across generations, and the power of choosing moral principles over legal technicalities. The work was challenging, often emotionally draining, and never financially lucrative, but it provided a sense of purpose that I had never found in any other aspect of my life. 2 years after returning the necklace, I stood in my new apartment in Washington, D.C., looking at walls covered with letters from families I had helped reunite with lost treasures. The space was larger than my studio in Riverdale, though still modest by my family's standards, but it felt rich in ways that had nothing to do with material possessions. The simple gold bracelet caught the light from my desk lamp as I worked on my latest case, a painted porcelain tea service that had belonged to a family in Prague before the war. The pieces had surfaced at an antique shop in Denver, and I was working to connect them with descendants who lived in Israel and Canada. My phone rang, interrupting my research. The caller ID showed my mother's number, and I answered, expecting our usual weekly check-in conversation. "Cassie, I have news that I think will interest you. Do you remember Mrs. Patterson from down the street when you were growing up?" "Of course, the elderly woman with all the cats." "She passed away last month, and her daughter found something in her attic that she thinks might be similar to your grandmother's necklace situation. Would you be willing to talk to her about it?" The call represented something I had never expected: my family's recognition that the work I was doing was valuable enough to recommend to others. It was a small gesture, but it meant that at least some family members had come to understand that my decision about the necklace had led to something meaningful, rather than just representing a financial loss. As I prepared to contact Mrs. Patterson's daughter about whatever treasure might be hidden in her mother's attic, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this point. The woman who had been mocked for wearing costume jewelry to her cousin's engagement party had become someone who specialized in recognizing the true value of objects that others might overlook. My grandmother's necklace had cost me $1 million and taught me that the most valuable inheritances aren't always the ones that can be measured in money. Sometimes they're the ones that teach us who we're meant to become when faced with choices between profit and principle. The heart-shaped charm on Sarah's bracelet reminded me daily that the greatest treasures are the connections we build with others and the integrity we maintain when making difficult decisions. These gifts that no amount of criticism from family members or financial pressure could ever take away. I had found my calling in helping others navigate the complex emotions and ethics of cultural heritage. Each day brought new opportunities to honor my grandmother's real legacy while building a life that felt authentic and meaningful in ways that simply owning valuable objects never could have provided. The necklace was gone, but the values it had taught me to embrace were mine forever. And in the end, that was an inheritance worth far more than any cashmere sapphire could ever be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.